He was only 7 years old when he touched a piano for the first time. His mother had taken him to a small church near their apartment because she wanted him to hear the choir sing. But the boy wasn't interested in the singing. His eyes were fixed on something else. In the corner of that old church sat a dusty piano that nobody was playing. While his mother closed her eyes and listened to the hymns, the boy quietly walked toward the instrument. He didn't know what he was doing. He just felt something pulling him there. When his small fingers pressed down on the keys, the sound that came out made his heart race. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even a real song. But in that moment, something inside him woke up. His mother found him sitting at that piano bench, tears rolling down his face. She didn't understand why he was crying. Neither did he. But she knew, deep in her bones, that her son had found the thing he was born to do. They didn't have much money. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. His father had left before he was born, and she never spoke about him. It was just the 2 of them against the world. But somehow, she managed to save enough to buy him a small keyboard from a second-hand store. It was missing 3 keys and the sound was slightly off. But to him, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever owned. He taught himself to play. Every night after his mother came home exhausted from work, he would sit in their tiny living room and practice for hours. He learned by watching videos. He learned by listening to recordings. He learned by making mistakes and fixing them over and over again. By the time he was 12, people in the neighborhood started calling him a prodigy. By 15, he was performing at local events and small competitions. By 18, he received a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the country. The day he got that acceptance letter was the happiest day of his mother's life. She held the paper in her hands and cried for almost an hour. All those years of sacrifice, all those double shifts and sleepless nights, it had all been worth it. He moved to the city to study. The conservatory was everything he had dreamed of and more. He was surrounded by talented musicians from all over the world. He had access to practice rooms with grand pianos that cost more than his mother earned in 5 years. His professors said he had a rare gift. They said his playing had something most students lacked: soul. For 3 years, everything was perfect. He was at the top of his class. He won competitions. He was invited to perform at events that most students could only dream about. His future seemed bright and certain. Everyone said he would be famous one day. Everyone said he would play in the greatest concert halls in the world. Then, in the winter of his 4th year, everything changed. It started with a phone call. His mother's voice on the other end was weak and shaky. She told him not to worry. She told him it was probably nothing, but he could hear the fear underneath her words. She had been feeling tired lately, more tired than usual, and there was pain in her joints that wouldn't go away. He took a bus home that same night. When he saw her, his heart dropped. She looked different, thinner, paler. The woman who had always been so strong now looked fragile, like she might break if he hugged her too tight. The doctors ran tests, lots of tests. The diagnosis came back a week later. It was an autoimmune disease, rare and aggressive. Her own body was attacking itself, and there was no simple cure. The treatments were experimental and expensive, very expensive. He went back to the conservatory, but his mind was never really there anymore. He sat in lectures thinking about hospital bills. He practiced scales while calculating numbers in his head. The cost of his mother's treatment was astronomical. Insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. He tried to work part-time jobs between his classes. He took every small performance gig he could find. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The bills kept piling up like a mountain he couldn't climb. Then came the letter from the conservatory. His grades had slipped. His attendance was poor. They understood his situation, they said. They were sympathetic, but rules were rules. If he couldn't maintain his academic standing, he would lose his scholarship. He tried to explain. He tried to beg. But the administrators just shook their heads and said their hands were tied. 2 months later, he was no longer a student. He sold everything he could: his books, his nice clothes, the watch his mother had given him for his 18th birthday. He moved back home to take care of her, working whatever jobs he could find during the day and sitting by her bedside at night. But medical bills don't wait for you to get back on your feet. They keep coming, each one bigger than the last. Collection agencies started calling. Then came the notices about the apartment: past due, final warning, eviction. Within a year, they lost everything. The apartment his mother had worked so hard to keep. The furniture she had bought piece by piece over decades. All of it gone. She was moved to a long-term care facility that accepted patients who couldn't pay up front. It was clean and the staff was kind, but it was charity. And he could see in his mother's eyes how much that hurt her pride. As for him, he had nothing left. No home, no job, no degree. The only thing he still owned was a portable keyboard. It was old and the batteries barely held a charge anymore. But he couldn't sell it, he just couldn't. It was the last piece of who he used to be. He started living in his car, a beat-up sedan that was almost as old as he was. He parked in different spots each night, trying not to attract attention. He washed up in gas station bathrooms. He ate whatever was cheapest at the convenience store. One cold morning, after another sleepless night in the backseat, he made a decision. He carried his keyboard to a busy corner downtown, set it up on a folding stand, and placed an old hat on the ground in front of him. Then he started to play. The people walking past didn't see a conservatory-trained musician. They didn't see years of sacrifice and dreams that almost came true. They saw a homeless man on a street corner, playing music for spare change. Some of them dropped coins into his hat without even looking at him. Some of them walked faster to avoid eye contact. Some of them looked at him with pity, and somehow that felt worse than being ignored. He played for 8 hours that first day. His fingers ached. His back hurt from standing so long. When he finally counted the money in his hat, it was barely enough to buy a real meal. But he would be back tomorrow, and the day after that, because somewhere across the city his mother was fighting for her life, and this was the only way he knew how to help her. The same hands that had once performed in grand halls now played for strangers who didn't even know his name. The same talent that professors had called extraordinary was now worth nothing more than pocket change. This was his life now, and he had no idea if it would ever get better. Weeks passed, then months. The corner downtown became his office, his stage, and his only source of income. Rain or shine, hot or cold, he showed up every single day. He learned which hours brought the most foot traffic. He learned which songs made people stop and listen. He learned to smile even when his heart was breaking. Some days were better than others. On good days, he could make enough to buy food and put a little aside for his mother's expenses. On bad days, he barely made enough for a sandwich, but he never missed a day. He couldn't afford to. The hardest part wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was the way people looked at him, or rather, the way they didn't look at him. To most of the people rushing past, he was invisible, just another homeless person on the street, just another problem they didn't want to think about. He tried not to let it bother him. He reminded himself why he was doing this. Every coin that landed in his hat was a coin that could help his mother. Every dollar was a small victory. That's what he told himself when the loneliness got too heavy. One afternoon in late autumn, he was playing a soft melody. The sky was gray and the air had that bitter chill that warned of winter coming soon. His fingers were stiff from the cold, but he kept playing. A small crowd had gathered to listen. Maybe 5 or 6 people. That was actually pretty good for a weekday. He was halfway through the song when he heard the laughter. It came from across the street. A group of young professionals had just walked out of an expensive restaurant. There were 4 of them, 3 men and 1 woman. They were dressed in designer clothes, the kind that cost more than what he made in a month. They were talking loudly, clearly enjoying themselves after what looked like a long lunch. One of the men pointed at him. He said something to his friends and they all laughed. Then they started walking toward him. He tried to focus on his music. He told himself to just keep playing. Maybe they would drop some money and move on. Maybe they were actually interested in listening. He was wrong. The group stopped right in front of him. The man who had pointed at him was clearly the leader. He had the kind of confidence that comes from growing up with money, the kind of smile that said he had never struggled for anything in his life. "Well, well," the man said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Look at this. A piano man on the streets. How romantic." His friends laughed again. The woman with them looked slightly uncomfortable, but she didn't say anything. He stopped playing. "Good afternoon," he said quietly. "Would you like to hear a request?" The rich man raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. "Oh, he speaks. I thought you were just a trained monkey hitting keys." More laughter from his friends. He felt his face getting hot, but he kept his voice calm. "I play all kinds of music, classical, jazz, pop, whatever you'd like." The rich man pulled out his wallet. For a moment, hope flickered in his chest. Maybe this guy would actually give him something decent. Some of the wealthy people who stopped by were surprisingly generous. But instead of handing him money properly, the man pulled out a crumpled bill and tossed it at his feet. It landed in a small puddle from last night's rain. "There you go," the man said. "Buy yourself something nice, maybe a shower." His friends burst out laughing. A few people in the small crowd that had gathered looked away awkwardly. Nobody said anything. He bent down to pick up the wet bill. His hands were shaking, not from the cold this time. As he reached for the money, he looked up and finally noticed the woman in the group properly. Their eyes met for just a second. His heart stopped. He knew her. She had been in his class at the conservatory. They had studied together, practiced together. She had once told him that his playing made her feel things she couldn't put into words. They had been friends, maybe even something more in another life. She recognized him too. He could see it in her eyes, the flash of shock, the moment of realization. Then, just as quickly, something else. She looked away, pretended not to know him, pretended he was nobody. That hurt more than anything the rich man had said. She was with him now, apparently. This arrogant man who threw money at homeless people for fun. She had moved on to a different life while he had fallen into this one. The rich man noticed the exchange. His smile got wider and nastier. "Wait a minute," he said slowly. "Do you two know each other?" She shook her head quickly. "No, I have no idea who this is." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. 3 years of friendship, late nights practicing in the same room, conversations about dreams and futures, and now she was pretending he didn't exist. The rich man studied him with new interest. "Let me guess. You went to some fancy music school, thought you were going to be a big star, and now look at you." He spread his arms wide, gesturing at the street corner, the hat with coins, the old keyboard. "This is your stage now." He didn't respond. What could he say? "You know what I think," the man continued, stepping closer. "I think people like you are failures because you deserve to be. You had opportunities. You wasted them. And now you want the rest of us to feel sorry for you." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. One woman actually walked away, shaking her head, but nobody stood up for him. Nobody told this man to stop. "My father always said that success is a choice," the rich man went on. "Winners choose to win, losers choose to lose, and you, my friend, are clearly a loser." He could feel tears stinging the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of these people. The rich man checked his expensive watch. "Well, this has been entertaining, but we have places to be." He looked at his friends. "Come on, let's leave the beggar to his little concert." As they turned to walk away, he said one last thing over his shoulder. "Maybe practice more. One day you might actually be good enough to play somewhere real. More laughter. And then they were gone, disappearing into a waiting car that probably cost more than he would earn in 10 years of playing on this corner. He stood there for a long moment, frozen. The small crowd had mostly scattered. The people who remained wouldn't meet his eyes. He looked down at the crumpled, wet bill in his hand. $5. That's what his dignity was worth today. His hands were still shaking when he sat back down at his keyboard. He tried to play, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate. The notes came out wrong, clumsy, broken. For the first time since he started playing on the streets, he packed up early. He couldn't do it anymore. Not today. That night in his car, he finally let the tears come. He cried for his mother, who was fighting a battle she might not win. He cried for the future that had been stolen from him. He cried for the friend who had looked right through him like he was nothing. But most of all, he cried because a small part of him wondered if that rich man was right. Maybe he was a failure. Maybe he did deserve this life. Maybe his dreams had always been too big for someone like him. He almost gave up that night. He almost decided to stop playing, to stop fighting, to just let go. But then he thought about his mother. She had never given up on him, not once in his entire life. When everyone else doubted him, she believed. When the world said no, she found a way to say yes. How could he give up on himself when she had never given up on him? He wiped his tears, he took a deep breath, and he made a decision. Tomorrow he would go back to that corner. He would set up his keyboard. He would place his hat on the ground, and he would play. Not because he believed things would get better, but because giving up was not something his mother had taught him to do. He had no way of knowing that tomorrow would change everything. The next morning came too quickly. He had barely slept. His eyes were swollen from crying, and his body ached from another night curled up in the backseat of his car. Every part of him wanted to stay hidden. Every part of him wanted to disappear. But he got up anyway. He drove to his usual corner, parked a few blocks away, and carried his keyboard through the cold morning air. His breath came out in small white clouds. Winter was definitely here now. He could feel it in his bones. Setting up felt harder than usual. His fingers were numb and clumsy. The keyboard stand wobbled on the uneven sidewalk. When he finally got everything in place, he just sat there for a moment, staring at the keys. What was he doing? What was the point of any of this? He thought about the rich man's words from yesterday. Loser, failure, trained monkey. The phrases played on repeat in his head like a song he couldn't stop hearing. Then he thought about his mother. Right now, she was probably waking up in that care facility. Maybe she was looking out the window, wondering how her son was doing. She didn't know he was homeless. He had lied to her, told her he had a small apartment and a job at a music store. He couldn't bear to add his problems to her already heavy burden. He took a deep breath and placed his fingers on the keys. And he played. The first few notes were shaky, uncertain, but as the music continued, something shifted. The sounds began to flow more smoothly. The melody started to take shape. Before long, he had forgotten about the cold, forgotten about yesterday, forgotten about everything except the music pouring out of him. This was the only place where he felt like himself anymore. When he played, he wasn't a homeless man on a street corner. He wasn't a failure or a dropout. He was just a musician, doing the thing he was born to do. People walked by. Some stopped briefly to listen. A few dropped coins into his hat. He nodded his thanks without breaking his concentration. The morning slowly turned into afternoon. He didn't notice the old woman. She had been sitting on a bench across the street for almost 2 hours, watching him. She wore a simple gray coat and a silk scarf that had seen better days. Her white hair was pulled back neatly, and her posture was straight despite her age. There was something elegant about her, something that suggested she had once been someone important. She had come downtown for a doctor's appointment. Nothing serious, just the usual checkups that come with getting older. After leaving the clinic, she had decided to walk for a while instead of taking a taxi home. That's when she heard the music. At first, she thought it was coming from a shop. Some stores played classical music to attract customers, but this was different. This wasn't a recording. This was live, and it was extraordinary. She followed the sound until she found him. A young man on a street corner, playing a portable keyboard like his life depended on it. She sat down on the nearest bench and listened. The old woman knew music. She had spent her entire life surrounded by it. Her late husband had been a composer, one of the greatest of his generation. For 40 years, she had attended concerts, hosted musicians, and helped discover new talent. She had heard thousands of pianists in her lifetime, from beginners to world-famous masters. This young man on the street corner was special. She knew it within the first 30 seconds. It wasn't just his technique, though that was impressive. It was something deeper. There was emotion in every note he played. Pain, hope, longing. His music told a story without using any words. That was rare. That was a gift that couldn't be taught. She watched as people walked past him without a second glance. She watched as they tossed coins without really listening. And she wondered how the world had missed someone this talented. When he finally took a break, she stood up slowly and walked across the street toward him. He looked up as she approached. His expression was guarded, careful. After yesterday, he wasn't sure what to expect from strangers anymore. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was soft but steady. "I've been listening to you play." He nodded politely. "Thank you. Any requests?" She smiled slightly. "Not exactly. I was wondering if we could talk for a moment." He hesitated. In his experience, people who wanted to talk usually wanted something, or they wanted to lecture him about getting a real job, or they wanted to pray for him. He had heard it all. But there was something different about this woman, something in her eyes that seemed genuine. "Sure," he said finally. "I could use a short break anyway." She sat down on a small ledge near his setup. He stayed on his bench, keeping a comfortable distance. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked. He was surprised by the question. Most people who stopped to talk asked where he slept or why he didn't get help from a shelter. Nobody asked about his music. "I taught myself at first," he said. "Then I went to the conservatory for a while." "Which one?" He told her the name. Her eyebrows rose slightly, impressed. "That's one of the best programs in the country. What happened?" He was quiet for a moment. He didn't usually share his story with strangers, but something about this woman made him feel safe. Maybe it was her age. Maybe it was the kindness in her eyes, or maybe he was just tired of carrying everything alone. So he told her about his mother's illness, about the medical bills, about losing his scholarship, then losing everything else, about ending up here on this corner playing for coins. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Life is often unfair to the most deserving people," she said softly. "I've seen it happen too many times." He shrugged. "It is what it is. I'm not looking for pity. I just need to help my mother." She studied him carefully. "You know, my husband was a composer. He passed away 3 years ago. But before he died, he always used to say that true talent finds a way to shine, no matter how dark things get." He didn't know what to say to that. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small card. It was cream-colored with elegant gold lettering. "There's a charity gala next Saturday," she said, "at one of the big hotels downtown. Very fancy. Lots of wealthy people who donate to various causes." She paused. "The pianist who was supposed to perform had to cancel. Family emergency. The committee has been scrambling to find a replacement." He stared at her, not understanding where this was going. "I'm on the board of the organization hosting the event," she continued. "I'd like you to perform." For a moment he was sure he had heard her wrong. "Me? Perform at a gala?" "Yes." "Ma'am, I don't. I mean, look at me." He gestured at his worn clothes, his tired face, the hat with coins sitting on the ground. "I'm not exactly gala material." She smiled. "The gala doesn't need material, it needs music, real music, and you have that." He shook his head slowly. "I don't have proper clothes. I don't have anywhere to prepare. I haven't performed formally in over a year." "Leave the clothes to me," she said. "As for preparation, you have a week, and from what I just heard, you don't need much practice. You need an audience that will actually listen." He looked down at the card in her hand. This felt like a dream. Things like this didn't happen in real life, not to people like him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "You don't even know me." She stood up, still holding out the card. "Because my husband spent his whole life believing that music could change the world, and I just spent 2 hours watching you prove him right." She placed the card on his keyboard. "Think about it. Call the number on the card if you decide to say yes." She turned to walk away, then stopped and looked back. "One more thing. Whatever happened to you, whatever people have said about you, don't let it define who you are. The world is full of people who will try to make you feel small. Don't give them that power." Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd like she had never been there at all. He sat alone with the card in his hand, reading the words over and over. A charity gala, a real performance, a chance to play for people who might actually hear him. It seemed impossible, it seemed crazy. But for the first time in months, something flickered in his chest that he had almost forgotten how to feel. Hoping. The week passed in a blur. He called the number on the card the very next day. A woman with a professional voice confirmed everything the old lady had told him. Yes, there was a gala. Yes, they needed a pianist. Yes, he was being offered the position. It still didn't feel real. 2 days before the event, a package arrived at the address he had given them. It was a clothing store downtown, one he could never afford to walk into, let alone buy from. Inside the package was a complete tuxedo, tailored to his measurements. There was also a note in elegant handwriting. "Every artist deserves to look the part. Play your heart out. I'll be watching." He tried on the tuxedo in a gas station bathroom. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The man staring back at him looked polished, professional, like someone who belonged on a stage, not on a street corner. For a moment, he let himself imagine what his life could have been. Concert halls, standing ovations, his mother sitting in the front row, healthy and proud. Then he pushed those thoughts away. He couldn't afford to dream right now. He had a job to do. The night of the gala arrived faster than he expected. He had spent the last few days practicing on his keyboard, running through piece after piece until his fingers knew every note by memory. He chose to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1. It was one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, but it was also one of the most emotional. It demanded everything from the performer: technical perfection, emotional depth, complete surrender to the music. It was the piece he had played for his final recital at the conservatory, back when his future still seemed bright. It felt right to play it now. The hotel where the gala was being held was the building he had ever seen. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings that seemed impossibly high. The floors were polished marble that reflected the light like mirrors. Everywhere he looked, there were wealthy people in expensive clothes. Laughing and drinking champagne like money was something they never had to think about. He entered through a side door, as instructed. A staff member led him to a small room backstage where he could wait until it was time to perform. The room had a mirror, a chair, and a small table with a glass of water. Nothing else. He sat down and tried to calm his breathing. His hands were shaking, not from the cold this time, from fear. What was he doing here? These people didn't know him. They didn't care about him. To them, he was just entertainment, background music for their expensive dinner. But then he thought about the old woman. She had believed in him. She had given him this chance when nobody else would. He couldn't let her down. He thought about his mother. She was the reason he was doing any of this. Every note he played tonight would be for her. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, his hands had stopped shaking. A knock on the door. 5 minutes, someone said from outside. He stood up, straightened his tuxedo, and walked toward the stage. The ballroom was even more impressive than the lobby. Hundreds of guests sat at round tables covered in white cloth and decorated with flowers. Candles flickered everywhere, casting a warm golden glow. At the front of the room, on a small raised platform, sat a grand piano, of the kind of instrument that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. As he walked toward the stage, he kept his eyes forward. He didn't want to look at the crowd. He didn't want to see their faces. He just wanted to reach the piano and let the music do the talking. But then he heard it, a familiar voice, a familiar laugh. "Wait a minute, is that who I think it is?" He turned his head slightly, and there at one of the front tables sat the rich man from the street corner, the same arrogant smile, the same expensive suit, the same cruel eyes. Sitting next to him was the woman who had pretended not to know him, his former classmate, his former friend. The rich man was already leaning over to whisper to the people at his table. He could see them looking at him, some with confusion, others with amusement. The rich man said something, and a few of them laughed quietly. His heart started pounding. His palms felt sweaty. Every instinct told him to turn around and run. These people would never accept him. They would never see him as anything more than the beggar they had mocked on the street. But then he remembered something the old woman had said. Don't let them define who you are. Don't give them that power. He lifted his chin and walked the rest of the way to the piano. He sat down on the bench, adjusted his position, and looked out at the crowd for the first time. Hundreds of faces stared back at him. Most of them were polite but uninterested. They were here for networking and champagne, not for music. A few looked skeptical, especially those at the rich man's table. He could feel their doubt like a weight pressing down on his chest. Then in the back of the room he spotted her, the old woman who had given him this chance. She was sitting alone at a small table, watching him with calm, steady eyes. She gave him a tiny nod. He placed his fingers on the keys. For a moment everything was silent. The clinking of glasses stopped. The whispered conversations faded. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. And then he began to play. The opening notes of the ballade floated through the air like a question being asked. Soft, gentle, almost fragile. A few guests continued their quiet conversations, assuming this would be nothing special. But as the piece progressed, something changed. The melody grew stronger, more complex. His fingers moved across the keys with a precision and passion that demanded attention. The conversation stopped. The champagne glasses were set down. One by one, every person in that room turned to look at the young man at the piano. He played like his life depended on it, because in many ways it did. He thought about his mother as he played. He thought about all the nights she had worked double shifts so he could practice. He thought about the pride in her eyes when he got into the conservatory. He thought about her lying in that hospital bed, fighting a battle she shouldn't have to fight alone. He thought about the rich man who had called him a loser. He thought about the woman who had pretended not to know him. He thought about all the people who had walked past him on the street without seeing him. But most of all, he thought about the music, the thing that had saved him when nothing else could, the gift that nobody could take away from him, no matter how much they tried. The piece built toward its climax. His hands flew across the keys, creating sounds that filled every corner of the massive ballroom. The music was no longer just notes and rhythms. It was emotion made audible. It was pain and hope and loss and love, all woven together into something beautiful. When he struck the final chord, the sound hung in the air for what felt like forever. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. He sat frozen at the piano, suddenly terrified. Had he made a mistake? Had they hated it? Should he have played something simpler, something safer? Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, someone started clapping. It was the old woman, standing up from her table with tears in her eyes. Another person joined her, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet. The applause was thunderous, echoing off the walls and the chandeliers and the marble floors. People were cheering. Some were wiping their eyes. Others were looking at each other in disbelief, as if they couldn't quite believe what they had just witnessed. He stood up slowly from the piano bench, overwhelmed. He had imagined this moment so many times, but the reality was more than he could handle. His eyes burned with tears he refused to let fall. He looked over at the rich man's table. The arrogant smile was gone. In its place was something else. Shock, confusion, maybe even a little shame. The woman beside him, his former classmate, was staring at the floor. She couldn't meet his eyes. He didn't feel satisfaction. He didn't feel revenge. He just felt tired and relieved, and something else he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like himself again. The applause seemed to go on forever. He stood beside the piano, not knowing what to do with his hands, not knowing where to look. This kind of attention felt foreign to him now. For so long, he had been invisible. Now hundreds of eyes were fixed on him, and every single one of them was filled with admiration. When the clapping finally died down, something unexpected happened. People started leaving their tables and walking toward him, not to mock him, not to throw crumpled bills at his feet. They wanted to talk to him. They wanted to shake his hand. A woman in a red dress told him she had never heard anything so beautiful in her life. A man with gray hair and kind eyes said the performance had brought back memories of his late wife, who had loved Chopin. A younger couple asked if he had any recordings they could buy. He answered their questions as best he could, still feeling like he was floating outside his own body. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. Then a man in an expensive suit approached. But unlike the rich man who had mocked him on the street, this one had warmth in his eyes. "That was extraordinary," the man said, shaking his hand firmly. "I'm on the board of the City Symphony. We're always looking for fresh talent. I'd love to discuss an audition with you." Before he could respond, another person stepped forward. A woman who introduced herself as a music producer. She worked with a recording label that specialized in classical artists. She handed him a business card and told him to call her office first thing Monday morning. More people came. More handshakes. More business cards. More words of praise that he didn't know how to accept. His pockets were soon stuffed with cards from people who wanted to help him, work with him, support him. Through it all, he kept glancing toward the back of the room, looking for the old woman who had made this possible. But her table was empty. She had slipped away at some point without saying goodbye. He felt a pang of disappointment. He wanted to thank her. He wanted to tell her that she had changed his life. Then he noticed something on the piano, a small envelope that hadn't been there before. His name was written on the front in elegant handwriting. He opened it carefully. Inside was a letter. The letter explained that the old woman's husband had left behind a foundation when he passed away. It was designed to support musicians who had exceptional talent but faced impossible circumstances. The foundation would cover all of his mother's medical expenses, every single bill, past, present, and future. There was more. The foundation would also pay for him to complete his education at the conservatory if he wanted to go back. No strings attached, no expectations, just an investment in his future. At the bottom of the letter, there was a short handwritten note. "Your music reminded me why my husband dedicated his life to this art. He would have loved to hear you play. I know you will do great things. The world needs more people like you." He read the letter 3 times. Then he sat down on the piano bench and cried. Not tears of sadness this time, tears of relief, tears of gratitude, Tears for all the nights he had spent hungry and cold, wondering if things would ever get better. They had gotten better. Against all odds, they had gotten better. The next few months moved quickly. His mother's treatment improved almost immediately once the financial pressure was lifted. The doctors were able to try new therapies, better medications, more comprehensive care. Within weeks, she was stronger than she had been in over a year. Within months, she was talking about coming home. He went back to the conservatory. It felt strange at first, walking through those halls again. Some of his old classmates recognized him. A few of them had heard about what happened at the gala. The story had spread quickly through the music community. The homeless pianist who had stunned a room full of wealthy donors. His professors welcomed him back with open arms. They said they had always known he would return. They said talent like his couldn't stay hidden forever. He worked harder than he had ever worked before. He practiced for hours every day, sometimes forgetting to eat or sleep. But it didn't feel like sacrifice anymore. It felt like purpose. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. The audition with the City Symphony went well, better than well. They offered him a spot as a guest performer for their spring concert series. It was a small role, but it was a start. A real start. The recording label signed him for a debut album. He spent weeks in the studio, pouring everything he had into each track. When the album was released, it received reviews that made him blush. Critics used words like profound and transcendent, and a voice for a new generation. But the moment that meant the most came on a quiet afternoon, almost 3 years after that gala performance. He was backstage at a concert hall. Not just any concert hall, the most famous one in the country. The one he had dreamed about since he was a boy, sitting in that church, touching piano keys for the first time. In a few minutes, he would walk onto that stage and perform for a sold-out audience. His debut solo concert, the thing he had wanted his entire life. A stagehand knocked on his dressing room door. 5 minutes, she said. He stood up and looked at himself in the mirror. The tuxedo was his own this time, not borrowed. His face looked healthier, fuller. The dark circles under his eyes were gone. He looked like someone who had finally found peace. But inside, he was still the same person. The boy who had taught himself to play on a broken keyboard. The young man who had lost everything and played on street corners for coins. The son who would do anything for his mother. He walked toward the stage. The lights were bright and warm. The audience was a sea of faces, all waiting for him. And there in the front row sat his mother. She was healthy now. Her hair had grown back, thick and beautiful. Her eyes were bright with tears she wasn't trying to hide. She looked at him the way she had looked at him that day in the church, when he was just a 7-year-old boy crying at a piano for reasons he didn't understand. He sat down at the grand piano, the same kind of he had played at the gala, but this time he wasn't nervous. This time he knew exactly who he was and why he was here. He placed his fingers on the keys. Before he played the first note, he looked out at the audience one more time. Somewhere in that crowd, he knew, there might be people who had doubted him, people who had looked down on him, maybe even people who had called him a failure. But there were also people who had believed in him. The old woman who had seen his worth when no one else did. The professors who had welcomed him back. The fans who had bought his album and written him letters saying his music had helped them through hard times. And most importantly, there was his mother. The woman who had worked 2 jobs so he could have a keyboard. The woman who had never stopped believing in him, even when he had stopped believing in himself. He played the first note, then the second, then the third. The music filled the concert hall, rising up to the ceiling and wrapping around every person in the audience. It was the same music he had played on cold street corners. The same music he had played through tears and hunger and loneliness. But now it was being heard the way it was meant to be heard. Not as background noise, not as begging, but as art, as expression. as proof that the human spirit can survive anything if it refuses to give up. When the final note faded into silence, the audience rose to their feet as one. But he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at his mother. She was standing too, clapping harder than anyone, tears streaming down her face. He had made it, not because he was lucky, not because he was special, but because he had kept going when everything told him to stop. And somewhere out there, he hoped the old woman was watching. He hoped she knew that her kindness had created this moment. One person believing in you can change everything. He had learned that the hard way, and he would never forget it.